It started with a closed-door meeting inside Sandringham House so secretive that even senior aides were ordered out of the corridor. But when King Charles emerged looking visibly shaken and Queen Camilla refused to answer waiting staff, palace insiders knew something catastrophic had unfolded behind those ancient estate walls. What began as a quiet disagreement over renovations has now exploded into a bitter royal standoff threatening the future of one of the monarchy's most sacred estates. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Reports suggest the confrontation began quietly during what was initially described as a routine estate planning session at Sandringham, the sprawling Norfolk sanctuary that has long served as one of the emotional anchors of the House of Windsor. But according to royal commentators and palace administrative whispers, the atmosphere inside the meeting shifted dramatically when a series of recommended modernization plans were presented directly to the king. These were not minor adjustments. Various interpretations of the proposal describe extensive redevelopment initiative, etc., and long-term financial optimization projects that some insiders allegedly believed could redefine the estate for a modern monarchy. Yet to King Charles, sources claim, the recommendations appeared to strike at something far more personal than architecture or budgeting. Sandringham was never simply land. It was memory, legacy, continuity. And for a monarch already carrying the physical and emotional burden of a fragile reign, the timing of the confrontation could not have been more devastating. Those familiar with the royal household's internal dynamics insist the tension had been building for months behind closed palace doors. Senior estate planners had reportedly pushed for sweeping updates designed to reduce costs and modernize operations across portions of the estate, while traditionalists within the royal institution argued such changes risked dismantling the sacred geography of the British monarchy itself. Insiders whisper that King Charles had initially entertained some revisions earlier in the year, particularly as concerns over royal finances and operational sustainability continued growing throughout 2026. However, something changed during the final review process. Multiple palace sources now claim the king became increasingly alarmed by the scale of the recommendations and the speed at which they were allegedly being advanced through internal channels. What began as cautious discussion reportedly evolved into a chilling power struggle over control, influence, and the future identity of Sandringham itself. The secrecy surrounding the meeting only intensified public speculation. Palace aides were allegedly instructed not to brief the press under any circumstances, an unusually strict protocol even by royal standards. Media insiders from London's Royal Press Circuit quietly noted that several scheduled communications were abruptly cancelled in the hours following the meeting, while estate personnel were reportedly warned against discussing internal matters with outside contacts. That silence became impossible to ignore when observers noticed Queen Camilla, appearing visibly frustrated during subsequent appearances linked to royal engagements. Different interpretations of her reaction describe everything from private disappointment to outright anger over the sudden reversal of plans many believe had already been informally approved, and within the context of a monarchy already navigating illness, succession anxiety, and growing institutional pressure, the optics of division inside Sandringham carried enormous implications. Royal historians were quick to draw comparisons to previous disputes surrounding Balmoral and other royal sanctums where questions of inheritance, stewardship, and legacy triggered deep internal fractures. But the reality reveals something potentially even more unsettling. This conflict allegedly blindsided not just estate planners, but members of multiple royal households who believed the modernization proposals were part of a broader strategy to prepare the monarchy for a drastically different future. Sources close to palace operations claim several senior figures were left stunned by how decisively King Charles intervened once the final recommendations crossed his desk. Some reportedly viewed it as an act of preservation. Others interpreted it as a desperate attempt to reclaim authority during a period of mounting vulnerability. Either way, the emotional fallout inside royal circles appears impossible to contain, and as whispers continue to spread, through the corridors of Sandringham and Buckingham Palace alike, one thing is becoming painfully clear. But this wasn't really about renovations, it was about who controls the future of the crown's most symbolic inheritance. Long before today's royal tensions erupted, Sandringham stood as something far greater than a country estate. Hidden behind Norfolk's quiet countryside lies a sprawling royal sanctum tied to generations of monarchs, wartime decisions, Christmas traditions, and private grief. And now, reports suggest that sacred legacy has become the center of an explosive internal power struggle. For decades, Sandringham existed as one of the few places where the monarchy could retreat from the relentless machinery of public life. Purchased for the future King Edward VII in the 19th century, the estate slowly transformed into far more than a private residence. It became woven into the emotional identity of the House of Windsor itself. Prime ministers came and went, governments collapsed, wars reshaped Europe, yet Sandringham endured quietly in the background, untouched by political chaos, and protected by generations of royals who viewed the estate not merely as property, but as sacred ground. Royal historians have often described it as part of the monarchy's spiritual geography, a place where the institution appeared most human while simultaneously reinforcing its mystique. And perhaps that is exactly why the latest conflict surrounding the estate has sent such shockwaves through palace circles. Because when battles begin over places like Sandringham, they are never really about bricks, gardens, or finances alone. They are about identity, about memory, about who ultimately controls the soul of the crown. No monarch embodied that emotional connection more deeply than Queen Elizabeth II. Insiders close to the late Queen often describe Sandringham as one of the rare environments where she felt completely anchored to continuity and routine, especially during the difficult final years of Prince Philip's life. Christmas gatherings at the estate became symbolic rituals of stability for the British public, carefully preserved traditions that projected permanence even while the monarchy itself weathered scandal, uncertainty, and generational upheaval. After Philip's death, reports suggest the estate took on an even heavier emotional significance within royal circles. It was no longer simply associated with duty or celebration. It became tied to grief, remembrance, and the fading echoes of an older royal era now slipping away. That emotional weight reportedly shaped King Charles's early thinking once he ascended the throne. Sources claim he initially explored modernization projects across portions of the estate, believing updates were necessary to secure Sandringham's future sustainability for decades to come. But what may have started as practical planning soon evolved into something far more divisive. Different interpretations of the internal debates describe a growing fracture between those advocating preservation and those pushing for redevelopment. Estate planners allegedly raised concerns over mounting operational costs, aging infrastructure, and the enormous financial burden required to maintain a vast royal property in the modern age. Some advisors reportedly argued that selective redevelopment could protect Sandringham long-term, while adapting it for a changing monarchy increasingly scrutinized for its spending and relevance. Yet traditionalists inside the institution saw danger in that logic. To them, modernization rises. I see Ched opening the door to irreversible change. Palace administrative streams suggest fierce disagreements emerged over how much alteration the estate could endure before losing the very symbolism that made it valuable in the first place. And caught in the middle were estate staff members allegedly receiving conflicting royal directives from competing factions surrounding the king. Some were instructed to prepare for future upgrades. Others were quietly warned that preserving Sandringham's historic identity must remain the absolute priority. The result, according to insiders, was confusion, tension, and growing anxiety spreading through royal households already struggling under immense institutional pressure. At the heart of the conflict sat King Charles himself, increasingly torn between stewardship and transformation. Those familiar with his long-term vision claim he wanted Sandringham to survive not just as a monument to the past, but as a functioning part of the monarchy's future. However, the reality reveals a painful contradiction. Every proposed change reportedly triggered fears of betraying Queen Elizabeth's legacy while simultaneously exposing the crown to accusations of stagnation if nothing evolved at all. And as whispers intensified around inheritance, authority, and succession planning, the debate surrounding Sandringham allegedly became entangled with a far larger question haunting the monarchy behind closed doors. Who would ultimately shape the institution after Charles himself was gone? And according to palace whispers, the conflict became deeply personal the moment competing factions began fighting for influence around the king. Reports suggest the real battle wasn't happening in public at all. It was unfolding quietly among royal aides, estate managers, and trusted advisors behind palace doors. What looked like a simple construction dispute allegedly spiraled into a chilling internal revolt over loyalty, access, and power. As whispers surrounding Sandringham spread deeper into palace circles, the atmosphere inside the royal household reportedly began to fracture in ways few outsiders initially understood. On the surface, officials continued presenting the disagreement as a routine discussion over estate planning and modernization. But behind the scenes, insiders claim an entirely different struggle was taking shape, one rooted not just in architecture, lecture or finances, but an influence over the king himself during one of the most vulnerable periods of his reign. Advisors who had once operated in careful alignment allegedly split into rival camps almost overnight. Some argued that King Charles had no choice but to modernize key areas of Sandringham if monarchy hoped to survive the economic and political pressures looming over the institution. Others viewed those same proposals as dangerously reckless, a betrayal of the traditions Queen Elizabeth had spent decades protecting with near-sacred devotion. And as both sides quietly fought for control of the narrative, the emotional pressure surrounding the king reportedly intensified with every passing week. Different interpretations of internal palace discussions suggest the financial realities tied to Sandringham became impossible to ignore. Maintaining vast royal estates had allegedly become increasingly expensive, particularly amid growing public scrutiny over royal spending and questions surrounding the monarchy's long-term relevance. Some estate planners reportedly pushed for aggressive redevelopment initiatives designed to reduce operational costs and create more sustainably the revenue streams for the future. But traditionalists inside the firm allegedly reacted with alarm, warning that once modernization crossed a certain threshold, Sandringham risked losing the very identity that made it symbolically untouchable. To them, the estate represented continuity stretching across generations of monarchs, a living reminder that the crown existed beyond temporary political trends or financial calculations. Sources close to royal operations claim those ideological divisions slowly hardened into something far more dangerous than professional disagreement. They became personal. Estate officials were allegedly caught in the middle of the growing chaos. According to palace administrative whispers, some staff members received instructions encouraging them to prepare for potential redevelopment phases, while others were privately warned to delay implementation until further notice from senior royal figures. The confusion reportedly triggered deep anxiety throughout Sandringham's internal operations. Meetings became increasingly tense. Communications allegedly broke down between departments, and morale inside the estate reportedly deteriorated as staff members found themselves trapped between competing royal directives they neither fully understood nor felt safe questioning. One palace insider reportedly described the atmosphere as tense and icy, with many fearing that choosing the wrong side in the conflict could permanently damage their future within the institution. At the center of the storm stood King Charles himself, increasingly frustrated by leaks, resistance, and what insiders claim he viewed as attempts to pressure him into decisions before he was ready. Sources familiar with the situation suggest the king became deeply unsettled by the realization that confidential estate discussions were somehow reaching royal commentators and media insiders with alarming speed. Each leak only deepened suspicion inside palace walls. Questions reportedly emerged about who was briefing journalists, which advisors could still be trusted, and whether certain factions were deliberately manipulating the crisis to strengthen their own influence over the monarchy's future direction. That paranoia allegedly created a chilling ripple effect throughout royal operations, forcing aides into silence and fueling further mistrust among competing camps. Meanwhile, from Queen Camilla's inner circle reportedly became closely associated with those favoring broader modernization efforts, though palace sources remained divided over how directly involved she truly was in the strategic discussions. Some insiders claim her allies believed Sandringham needed to evolve aggressively in order to protect its future relevance. Others insist those reports have been exaggerated by rival factions eager to frame the Queen as overly ambitious during a period of royal instability. But regardless of where the truth ultimately lies, the perception of division alone proved enormously damaging. Because inside the House of Windsor, perception often becomes reality long before official statements ever emerge, and as traditionalists within the monarchy continued resisting rapid change with increasing intensity, the crisis surrounding Sandringham reportedly reached a dangerous breaking point. But the conflict escalated dramatically when one recommendation reportedly crossed a line Charles could not ignore. According to multiple royal insiders, the turning point came during a late-night briefing involving proposed changes that would have fundamentally transformed portions of the Sandringham estate. And for King Charles, the recommendation reportedly felt less like modernization and more like an assault on royal legacy itself. By the time that final meeting took place, tensions inside palace walls had already reached dangerous levels. Advisors were no longer merely debating architectural updates or financial strategies. The atmosphere had reportedly hardened into open ideological warfare over the future identity of the monarchy itself. Sources familiar with the discussions claim senior planners arrived at the briefing believing they were presenting realistic long-term solutions for the estate's survival in an increasingly uncertain royal era. But what unfolded instead allegedly triggered one of the most explosive internal confrontations of King Charles's reign. According to palace administrative whispers, several redevelopment proposals presented that evening involved far-reaching structural changes across portions of Sandringham's surrounding land and operational infrastructure. Some plans allegedly explored expanded commercial partnerships, public accessibility initiatives, and the repurposing of underused estate areas to generate stronger long-term revenue streams. Supporters reportedly argued such measures were necessary to preserve Sandringham financially for future generations. Yet to others inside the room, those recommendations crossed an invisible line the monarchy had protected for decades. Different interpretations of the briefing suggest the king's reaction was immediate and deeply emotional. Royal insiders claim Charles became visibly angered as discussions shifted from preservation toward what some allegedly viewed as the gradual commercialization of one of the crown's most sacred private sanctums. For years, the monarchy had already faced criticism over public funding, property management, and the balance between royal privilege and public accountability. But Sandringham occupied a uniquely fragile position within that debate because of its deeply personal ties to Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. To transform it too aggressively, traditionalists warned, risked reducing a symbol of continuity into something dangerously transactional. Sources close to palace operations claim Charles reportedly viewed certain recommendations as incompatible with the spiritual identity of the estate itself. One insider allegedly described the mood in the room as cold and stunned after the king began questioning whether those behind the proposals truly understood what Sandringham represented to the institution. Almost immediately, comparisons began surfacing to previous royal estate controversies that had haunted the monarchy for years. Royal historians quietly recalled tensions surrounding Balmoral preservation debates, as well as earlier disputes involving royal properties increasingly pressured to justify their costs in a changing Britain. But insiders suggest this moment felt different because it unfolded during an exceptionally vulnerable chapter of Charles's reign. The king was already facing enormous strain tied to health concerns, succession anxieties, and the relentless pressure of stabilizing the monarchy after years of public turbulence. Against that backdrop, reports of internal proposals that appeared to prioritize financial restructuring over royal heritage allegedly struck a deeply personal nerve. And as concerns mounted over how the public might react if details ever emerged, panic reportedly spread through multiple palace departments. Traditionalists within the firm allegedly moved quickly to reinforce their position by invoking Queen Elizabeth's long-standing philosophy toward royal stewardship. According to palace whispers, senior figures privately argued that the late queen had always treated Sandringham not as a commercial asset, but as a sacred trust held temporarily by each generation before passing to the next. Those arguments reportedly carried enormous emotional weight with Charles, who had spent much of his life preparing to inherit not just the crown, but the burden of preserving its most symbolic traditions. Some insiders even claim references were made to Philip's final years at Sandringham and the emotional importance the estate held for the late queen during periods of profound personal loss. In that moment, modernization allegedly stopped feeling like practical reform and began resembling betrayal. What happened next reportedly stunned even experienced palace veterans. Sources suggest King Charles ordered an immediate suspension of further redevelopment discussions before the meeting had fully concluded. Advisors connected to the proposals were allegedly instructed to halt planning reviews pending additional consultations, while communications office moved rapidly to contain any potential leaks surrounding the confrontation. Royal press offices reportedly tightened internal protocols within hours, fearing public speculation could spiral into a damaging narrative about division inside the monarchy. Yet despite those efforts, whispers had already begun escaping palace walls. And while the public saw silence, insiders claimed the fallout inside the monarchy had only just begun. By the following morning, the atmosphere around Sandringham had reportedly turned ice cold. Meetings were cancelled. Staff movements changed, and whispers began spreading across royal corridors that this wasn't merely a disagreement anymore. It was a full-scale battle over influence during one of the most fragile periods of King Charles's reign. What had once been framed as a confidential dispute over estate management suddenly began affecting nearly every layer of palace operations. According to insiders familiar with the aftermath, the emotional shockwaves from the late-night confrontation moved through Sandringham and Buckingham Palace with astonishing speed. Senior aides who had reportedly participated in the redevelopment discussions were quietly reassigned, signed or removed from sensitive planning responsibilities, fueling speculation that the king had lost trust in parts of his own advisory structure. Palace administrative streams suggest several internal meetings scheduled for the following days were abruptly cancelled without explanation, while communication between royal departments allegedly became tightly restricted. Even among long-serving staff members accustomed to the monarchy's rigid culture of secrecy, the atmosphere reportedly felt unusually tense. One estate insider allegedly described it as walking through silence after an explosion, a chilling reflection of just how deeply the crisis had rattled the institution behind closed doors. At the center of growing concern was King Charles himself. Sources close to royal operations claim the pressure surrounding the Sandringham conflict arrived during an already exhausting chapter of his reign, intensifying fears about the physical and emotional burden he had been carrying since early health concerns first emerged. For months, royal commentators had quietly noted signs of strain surrounding the king's public schedule and internal workload. But insiders now suggest the estate. My battle exposed a far more vulnerable reality unfolding privately behind palace walls. Charles was reportedly becoming increasingly isolated, caught between competing advisors, growing institutional pressure, and mounting fears over how history would ultimately judge his stewardship of the crown. Different interpretations of the situation describe a monarch desperate to preserve continuity while simultaneously confronting demands for modernization that threatened to reshape the monarchy faster than he could control. And within that fragile environment, every disagreement carried enormous emotional consequences. Reports also suggest Queen Camilla became deeply frustrated by the abrupt suspension of the redevelopment discussions. While palace sources remain divided on the extent of her involvement, insiders claim figures associated with her broader circle had supported portions of the modernization strategy and believed the proposals were being unfairly demonized by traditionalist factions within the firm. That perception allegedly intensified tensions between competing royal camps already, maneuvering carefully around the king's declining tolerance for internal conflict. Some comments. Tours quietly framed the dispute as symbolic of a larger ideological divide forming within the monarchy itself. Those seeking adaptation versus those determined to preserve every thread of royal continuity at almost any cost. And as whispers surrounding the crisis spread further into media circles, attention increasingly turned toward two senior figures many believed represented the old guard of institutional discipline, Prince William and Princess Anne. According to multiple royal observers, both William and Anne reportedly favored a far more cautious approach toward Sandringham's future. Anne, long regarded as one of the monarchy's fiercest protectors of duty and tradition, was allegedly deeply uneasy about proposals that risked altering the estate's historic character too aggressively. William, meanwhile, reportedly viewed the preservation of royal symbolism as essential to maintaining public trust during a period of growing uncertainty surrounding the crown's long-term stability. Sources close to palace operations claim their influence inside royal discussions quietly strengthened in the aftermath of the confrontation, particularly as Charles became increasingly wary of proposals perceived as commercially driven. And outside palace walls, that tension was beginning to attract public attention as well. Media outlets across Britain started noticing something unusual almost immediately. Palace briefings became unusually sparse. Royal correspondents described an atmosphere of controlled silence surrounding Sandringham, while commentators began openly speculating about internal fractures inside the monarchy. Estate insiders allegedly warned morale among staff had deteriorated sharply, with many uncertain about who still held authority over key decisions tied to the estate's future. Meanwhile, public sympathy appeared to shift steadily toward preserving royal heritage rather than embracing controversial redevelopment plans. What had started as an internal management dispute was now evolving into something far more politically dangerous, a symbolic struggle between duty and modernization at the very heart of the monarchy itself. And as tensions deepened behind palace walls, one haunting question remained: what does this reveal about the monarchy's future after Charles? As King Charles reportedly withdrew from the escalating conflict, attention quietly shifted to the other side. Two figures long viewed as the monarchy's ultimate guardians, Prince William and Princess Anne. And according to royal observers, their response behind the scenes may have changed the direction of the entire crisis. In the days following the Sandringham confrontation, insiders claim a subtle but unmistakable shift began taking place inside the royal institution. While King Charles reportedly stepped back from the center of the escalating dispute, exhausted by weeks of internal tension and emotional strain, Princess Anne and Prince William allegedly moved carefully into positions of growing influence. It was not a dramatic takeover. There were no public announcements, no official declarations, no visible signs that the balance of power inside the monarchy was quietly changing. But according to palace whispers, senior aides increasingly began looking toward Anne and William for stability as the atmosphere around Sandringham continued deteriorating. And within royal circles, that development carried enormous significance. Because few figures inside the House of Windsor command more trust among traditionalists than the Princess Royal herself, while William increasingly represents he monarchy's future in the eyes of both the institution and the public. Sources close to palace operations suggest Anne became one of the strongest internal voices pushing for strict preservation protections surrounding Sandringham. For years, she had cultivated a reputation as one of the monarchy's most disciplined defenders of continuity and duty, often described by royal commentators as embodying the old guard philosophy that the crown survives only when personal ambition remains secondary to institutional responsibility. Insiders claim Anne viewed portions of the redevelopment proposals not merely as risky, but fundamentally incompatible with the sacred role Sandringham occupied within royal history. According to various interpretations of internal discussions, she reportedly argued that once the monarchy allowed sentiment and symbolism to be sacrificed for efficiency, it risked weakening the very mystique that justified its existence in the modern world. That position allegedly resonated deeply with many long-serving palace figures already alarmed by the rapid pace of change surrounding the institution. At the same time, Prince William reportedly became increasingly involved, in future contingency discussions tied to the estate and the monarchy's broader long-term stability. Those familiar with internal royal planning claim William's focus extended beyond Sandringham itself. The crisis allegedly forced deeper conversations about public trust, institutional image, and the fragile transition awaiting the monarchy in the years ahead. Insiders suggest William became acutely aware that every decision tied to Sandringham was being quietly interpreted as a reflection of how the future crown might operate under his eventual reign. And unlike previous generations, he was navigating that pressure in an era dominated by relentless public scrutiny, media speculation, and declining tolerance for royal controversy. According to palace sources, William reportedly believed preserving the monarchy's symbolic foundations was essential if the institution hoped to survive the turbulence that could follow Charles's reign. As these discussions intensified behind closed doors, comparisons to the monarchy's old guard discipline reportedly became increasingly common inside palace corridors. Royal commentators noted that both Anne and William appeared focused less on modernizing at any cost and more on controlled stewardship rooted in continuity. That approach stood in stark contrast to factions that had pushed for faster transformation and more aggressive redevelopment strategies. Yet even as Anne and William's influence reportedly grew stronger, the emotional toll on King Charles became harder to ignore. Sources close to the royal household claim the king appeared increasingly drained by the constant conflict unfolding around him, trapped between preserving his mother's legacy and preparing the monarchy for a future he knew would demand adaptation. Different interpretations of his withdrawal describe everything from physical exhaustion, to quiet disappointment over how deeply divisions inside the institution had escalated. Meanwhile, insiders suggest Anne's authority behind the scenes expanded dramatically during this period. Palace staff reportedly viewed her as a stabilizing force capable of cutting through factional maneuvering with ruthless clarity. And as William aligned more closely with preservation-focused advisors, rival camps inside the monarchy allegedly found themselves forced into an uneasy compromise. The redevelopment push slowed. Internationally, now discussions became more cautious. Public silence remained firmly in place. But according to royal observers, the fragile calm that eventually emerged concealed deeper fractures still lingering beneath the surface. Because even if Sandringham itself had been temporarily protected, the trust between competing palace factions may already have been permanently damaged. But even as calm appeared to return, insiders claimed the damage inside the royal family may already be irreversible. What makes the Sandringham crisis so unsettling is that insiders insist it was never truly about architecture, money, or landscaping. Beneath the surface, this was allegedly a painful struggle over memory, legacy, and the terrifying realization that the monarchy is quietly entering a new era. As the immediate chaos surrounding the estate slowly began to settle, a heavier and far more emotional reality reportedly emerged inside palace walls. According to royal insiders, the Sandringham dispute forced members of the monarchy to confront questions they had spent years quietly avoiding. Questions about succession, about identity, about what remains of the old royal world once the generation shaped by Queen Elizabeth II finally disappears. Because while the public focused on redevelopment proposals and internal disagreements, those closest to the institution allegedly understood that the real crisis unfolding beneath the surface was far more existential. Sandringham had become symbolic of something larger than itself. It represented continuity in a monarchy increasingly haunted by uncertainty. And for King Charles, that burden reportedly became deeply personal. Sources close to royal operations claim Charles viewed the protection of Queen Elizabeth's legacy as one of the defining responsibilities of his reign. For decades, he had watched his mother preserve the monarchy through wars, scandals, political upheaval, and profound personal sacrifice. Sandringham stood at the center of many of those memories. It was where family traditions survived untouched by public spectacle, where Christmas rituals reinforced the image of stability the crown depended upon, where Philip spent some of his final years, and where the late Queen herself sought emotional refuge during moments of immense private grief. To Charles, insiders suggest, preserving Sandringham was not simply about honoring the past. It was about defending the emotional foundations of the monarchy itself during a period when almost everything else seemed to be changing at frightening speed. And perhaps that is why the redevelopment battle cut so deeply. Because every proposed alteration allegedly forced him to confront an impossible question. How do you modernize an institution built upon permanence without destroying the very illusion that keeps it alive? That fear reportedly spread far beyond the king. Palace sources described the atmosphere inside royal circles during the height of the crisis as emotionally draining and psychologically exhausting. Long-serving aides allegedly became increasingly aware that the Sandringham dispute was exposing deeper anxieties surrounding what the monarchy might eventually become after Charles's reign. For generations, Queen Elizabeth represented continuity so powerful that many Britons struggled to imagine the crown existing without her steady presence. But now, with Charles carrying the pressures of kingship under relentless scrutiny, insiders claim a growing number of royal figures have quietly begun thinking about the next transition already looming over the institution. And with that comes fear. Fear of instability. Fear of division. Fear that the monarchy's carefully maintained image of unity may be far more fragile than the public was ever supposed to see. Outside palace walls, public fascination with the crisis only intensified as official silence continued. Royal commentators increasingly framed the Sandringham conflict as a symbolic struggle between modernization and sacred tradition. While media speculation surrounding internal fractures kept expanding across Britain and beyond. What disturbed many observers most was not the disagreement itself, but the emotional intensity reportedly surrounding it. Because institutions do not fight this hard over buildings alone. They fight this hard when identity, memory, and survival are at stake. And according to multiple royal experts, The estate battle may ultimately be remembered less as an isolated controversy and more as an early warning sign of the conflicts still waiting beneath the surface of the modern monarchy. Questions surrounding succession planning, royal finances, institutional relevance, and competing visions for the future have not disappeared. If anything, insiders suggest the Ham crisis merely exposed how dangerous those tensions have already become behind closed doors. Now, every public appearance, every cancelled meeting, every carefully worded palace statement is being interpreted through the lens of uncertainty surrounding the monarchy's future after Charles. Because once the illusion of total unity begins to crack, it becomes impossible to fully restore. And while Sandringham itself may remain physically unchanged for now, the emotional damage caused by the conflict reportedly continues echoing throughout royal corridors in ways the public may never fully understand. Royal experts warn that future battles over legacy and modernization could become even more intense as generational transitions accelerate inside the House of Windsor. And in the end, the silence surrounding Sandringham may prove far more revealing than any official palace statement ever could.